Welcome to Here I Pod from ELCA Advocacy. A new social statement, Faith and Civic Life, seeking the well-being of all, was adopted by the ELCA Churchwide Assembly in 2025. Here I Pod presents a reading of the social statement, separated into 6 sections. Our recording of Faith and Civic Life began shortly after adoption, before a final copy was publicly available. So listeners are encouraged to refer to the ELCA Resource Center for the final, fully annotated version, linked in the show notes and reflected in the captions. While many contextual endnotes are read, all are not, but can be found in the final, fully annotated version. Now we continue with Section 3, Assessing the U.S. Constitutional Form of Government. Let's begin.
Section 3, Assessing the U.S. Constitutional Form of Government. Article 21. The Lutheran Confessions affirm political authority and political activity in principle as one way the triune God protects and coordinates the complex web of social and economic relationships for human well-being. Over time, Lutherans have come to understand, though, that we are called to live with a cautious watchfulness about all forms of government, because some provide better measures of well-being than others. Further, we have come to recognize more fully how sin permeates not simply individual action, but every human system and structure. In the Lutheran theological tradition, the key question asked about government is how well it serves God's purposes of justice and good order, especially in caring for the most vulnerable members of the community. Such discernment about political authority reaches as far back as the Reformation, as evident in Luther's catechisms and many writings of the Reformers. Note, for example, Johannes Bugenhagen, Luther's pastor, was deployed to several European government bodies to advocate for and help draft laws creating community chests, a welfare net to assist the poor. See Forgotten Luther Reclaiming the Social Economic Dimension of the Reformation. End note. The larger catechism says, quote, "It would therefore be fitting if the coat of arms of every upright prince were emblazoned with a loaf of bread instead of a lion or a wreath of rue," which is a medicinal herb, or if a loaf of bread were stamped on coins, close quote. Rather than conquering more land or gaining more wealth, the role of government should be focused on ensuring that each person receives all the necessities for daily well-being. Because the government is an indispensable structure of society, Lutherans historically have granted respect and obedience to good civil authorities and institutions, in line with Romans chapter 13. At the same time, the Lutheran tradition also maintains that there is a responsibility to assess and call individuals and institutions to account. The Lutheran heritage contains examples of leaders denouncing the misuse of those institutions and also cooperating with them toward the common good. How power is understood and used is key to this assessment.
Article 22. Human social life is an arena of multiple forms of power. This church teaches that an essential assessment of any use of power, whether in law, policy, or action, is whether it extends God's power for people and groups. This assessment is especially important with respect to those who have been denied power historically or marginalized by social systems. As the creator of all that is, God is sovereign, but God's sovereignty brings forth creatures who are not God, giving them power and sustenance. God's power creates creatures' power rather than depriving them of it. Divine self-giving power is always and everywhere plural. That is, divine power produces not one center of power, but multiple transmissions of power. That view of power is central to the Lutheran notion of justification by grace alone, Article 5. God's declaration of justification is God's sovereign act, but that sovereign act is communicated to us through faith. On earth, the point and power of justification is to fulfill and heal sinners through faith, i.e., to give sinners power to become what they were created to be. God's sovereign act is the beginning, quote, moment, close quote, of power, but is not fulfilled power. Similarly, the power of the Lord's Supper for Luther is the healing and strengthening of the recipient. God's dominion satisfies the needs of every living creature. Psalms 145. Divine power is not the usual political model of power. The common political understanding equates power with the ability to control and dominate. It is non-plural, that is, it seeks more for itself and less for others. This is the type of power referred to by the famous maxim, quote, power corrupts, close quote. This distorted power of domination and control stands in contrast with divine sovereignty, which is fulfilled in creating and increasing the equitable power of God's creatures. As such, all power can be assessed by its adherence to the divine creative and self-giving purpose. It can be assessed by the extent to which power is distorted and misused for the sake of domination and exploitation. This is true whether in government, civic interaction, organized religion, business, law enforcement, or the family. To the extent that human power is directed solely or primarily toward the control or domination of others, it is a sinful distortion of God's power. It is sin when power, which is meant to fulfill other creatures, is used instead to destroy the independent power of others, intentionally or unintentionally. Power exercised as domination hollows out those who are subject to it, whereas those in control lose the vitality that allows them to adapt. Like all power, governmental power is good in principle, but subject to systemic distortions and sinful impulses. This statement discusses systemic distortions in several places. Those in government, like all people, are sinners and are subject to limitations of knowledge, however well-meaning, and the temptation to not acknowledge limits. As a result, government may often seek its own advantage or that of most influential constituencies at the expense of many of its people. This is especially likely if one thinks of politics and civic engagement as primarily a collection of warring interest groups engaged in a zero-sum game of wins and losses. This view distorts power into a contest of domination and control. There are circumstances that do require the use of dominating power to defend against those who are doing significant harm, such as another government. In certain circumstances, even war might be legitimate. For example, to defend one's country against existential threats or to oppose totalitarian regimes. Under such circumstances, dominating power can be justified in good conscience to counter immense harm. Note, For Peace in God's World, 13. Theologian Paul Tillich calls this idea, quote, the strange work of love to destroy what is against love, close quote. See Love, Power, and Justice, Ontological Analysis, and Ethical Applications. End note. Even in those cases, however, Christians and others believe constraints must be observed. For example, non-combatants and former combatants, including those from the enemy side, should be treated with care as God's creatures, not as mere objects of control or domination.
Article 23. The lodestar of divine power implies additional criteria for assessing government action. God's self-giving, creative, and sustaining power gifts human creatures with agency, the ability to set their own course. The gifts of power, therefore, include a presumption for self-determination. Parentheses. However, this presumption for self-determination has little to do with the ideology of, quote, individualism, close quote. That is, that the interests of the individual ought to have priority, close parentheses. Thus, an important criterion for assessing government action is whether it extends the self-determination of the people, and thus their power. Practically, this means that the necessary starting point for considering what is good for others should be what those others believe is good for them. This has implications, for example, in deciding which level of government, if any, properly acts in a given situation. In many instances, a national government is needed. In other instances, a national government may be far removed from certain local realities. Likewise, local or state governments may be more removed from the effects of their actions on those outside their authority. Distance may increase the possibility for error in determining what will lead to another's well-being and what will damage others' self-determination and power. This is not a value judgment, but simply a description of the limits of government, even in a representative democracy. These possibilities, in turn, mean that both those in government and those they govern must ask what level of government is most appropriate and how best to design policies that foster self-determination. That is also why it is important to create opportunities to participate and be heard for those who will be most directly affected by those decisions. A presumption is, however, not a rule, and self-determination is not an absolute value. That is one difference from an ideology of individualism in which the individual's desires and beliefs are given priority and sheer autonomy. Self-determination is a presumption, a guardrail. Sometimes laws and regulations must oppose what people believe to be their own good. Individuals and groups can mistake what is good for them. The presumption for self-determination is especially necessary when what seems good for, quote, my group, close quote, significantly harms others and their self-determination. This is because self-determination already includes a norm of reciprocity. As a universal presumption, deriving from God's creative and sustaining power, it gives priority to others' self-determination as well. Self-determination's mutuality and its grounding in divine power distinguishes this view from individualism. Accordingly, this church stresses that self-determination always includes mutual, plural self-determination, which is also the sharing of power. It does not mean doing whatever one wants at the expense of others. Self-determination is necessarily mutual self-determination. This can be understood as a form of the golden rule. Extend to others their self-determination as you wish to have it extended to you. Note, Christians look to Matthew chapter 7, verse 12 as the golden rule. Other traditions have a comparable standard in their writings. End note. Both the model of divine power and the consequent political presumption of self-determination include a criterion of fostering multiple transmissions of power, i.e., plurality. Both are indispensable elements for thinking through the nature and purpose of governments, including those of the United States.
Article 24. In the United States, the Constitution, ratified in 1788, provides the federal framework for what political authority may and may not do with respect to its citizens and other governmental and non-governmental institutions. Note, for one comprehensive discussion of the Constitution's history, including its uniqueness and history of amendments, see Akil Reed Amar, America's Constitution, a biography. End note. It provides for a national government consisting of 3 authorities with distinct roles and power sharing: executive, legislative, and judicial. It reserves certain matters to the states and others to citizens of the country, regardless of the state in which they live. It also acknowledges indigenous sovereign governments. The U.S. Constitution was not utterly unique. There are precedents in human history for what we recognize as, quote, democracy, close quote, or, quote, a republic, close quote. The Constitution was not even the first governing framework of the fledgling United States. That distinction belonged to the Articles of Confederation, adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777 and ratified by the 13 states in 1781. Within a few years, it became clear that the young country likely would not survive under the Articles of Confederation. There was no effective executive power to enforce the National Congress's decisions, and the nation was in danger of defaulting on its own debts. The states had separate, often conflicting policies, which sometimes were aimed at other states, as well as separate currencies. These and other deficiencies produced a failure that gave rise to the Constitution. The Constitution was unique in crucial ways. The 1788 Constitution makes no mention of God or religion except to prohibit requiring religious tests for holding federal office. And for the first time in recorded history, the governing document of a people had to be ratified by the people it would govern rather than be imposed by a monarch, a sovereign state, or religious authority. The Constitution also strives against the monopolization of sovereignty and pure self-interest by instituting checks and balances across institutions and with the states. The structure of the new government was explicitly designed to combat extreme self-interest, which the drafters had experienced both under a parliamentary monarchy and among the states included in Articles of Confederation. It was controversial to provide for a strong executive, as the Constitution did. Because of that, the framers limited the executive branch, reserving certain matters for the legislature or the judiciary. Similarly, the Constitution provides for an executive not elected by Congress to limit Congress's power and influence. In addition to reserving some areas of authority for states, the Constitution provided all states with equal representation in the U.S. Senate to combat the fear that the larger states would ignore or destroy the vitality of smaller states. The courts were established to settle disputes and interpret laws. The authority of the courts was also checked by certain legislative and executive means. The Constitution is both grounding and aspirational. It serves as an example and points this society to values and practices that the nation has not yet fulfilled. Its preamble clearly expresses this government's purpose and provides a reference for assessing national faithfulness to that purpose. In the words of the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a moral perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." These aspirations provide secular standards for evaluating government and also give specificity to the Christian question, quote, "Is the neighbor's well-being served by the government?" Close quote.
Article 25. The most radical feature of the Constitution is its first three words, quote, "We, the people," close quote. Never before had those who would be governed been required to vote their government into effect, to, quote, "ordain and establish," close quote, it. Quote, "The people," close quote, "determine how they will be governed," and this sets up a preference for the self-determination that is inherent in the constitutional process, as much as, or more so, than the Constitution itself. The subsequent history of amendments to the Constitution makes this preference for self-determination more explicit. At the time of ratification, quote, "The people," close quote, was largely limited to free white men. Many states also imposed a property-owning qualification on the right to vote. Slavery was recognized and accepted by the Constitution. Indeed, slave-holding states received additional congressional representation through the constitutional clause counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person. even though those states denied them legal personhood and the vote. Most members of indigenous nations who were not granted U.S. citizenship until 1924 had no say in representation. Though American Indian sovereignty is recognized in the Constitution, that commitment was blatantly ignored as states and the federal government violated treaty after treaty, and it remains a source of struggle today. The preference for self-determination was thus partly realized in the Constitution and partly unrealized. Amendments to the Constitution have tended to make that aspiration more effective by reducing the number of groups who were, quote, governed, close quote, without their, quote, consent, close quote, by expanding the right to vote. Regarding people of African descent, the Reconstruction Amendments essentially said that the 1787 Constitution's, quote, grand bargain, close quote, to preserve slavery got wrong who, quote, we the people, close quote, should be. Later amendments granted the right of additional citizens to vote, women, 1920, and young adults ages 18 to 20, 1971. Levying any tax as a condition to vote was prohibited, 1964. Every amendment related to who is included in, quote, we the people, close quote, has expanded who may participate in mutual self-determination. However, there remain patterns of obstruction to restrict exercise of these rights. Like the theological presumption for mutual self-determination, the Constitution's, quote, we the people, close quote, has little in common with an ideology of individualism. The sovereignty of the people is a collective sovereignty and includes mutual self-determination. A core purpose of the protections of individual rights in the Bill of Rights and elsewhere is to strengthen, quote, we the people, close quote. The protection of individual and minority rights in the constitutional conception is necessary for a healthy collective.
Article 26. The framers of the Constitution recognized that self-dealing by states under the Articles of Confederation was already destroying the country and the states themselves. Humans continue to demonstrate, in greater or lesser measure, the tendency to want to dominate and control, to seek our advantage over our neighbor, not for their interests, but, in the end, for our own. Theologically, this tendency is part of the meaning we Lutherans recognize when we teach that even the justified are also sinners. Article 22 explains how government is subject to the same impulses. Accordingly, governmental action should be subject to the presumption that those governed have a right to identify what they see as their needs. Here, too, that presumption can be overcome, and government can act coercively upon those who are subject to it, particularly when those subjects are needlessly damaging others' capacity for self-determination. That assessment is a source of much criminal law, for example. As the government acts to prevent harmful behavior, the priority should be seeking to produce and share power in ways that promote the common good. Examples of this communication of power and well-being include compulsory school attendance, Social Security, and regulations to incentivize accomplishing social goals. A few of the questions to assess a government at federal, state, and local levels include: has this act opened room for the self-determination of those in its jurisdiction? Has this coercive authority adequately protected valuable mutual self-determination to a reasonable extent? Has this regulatory authority made the operation of the economy smoother so that those affected can live their lives more fully? Has this action assisted or encouraged those who want to participate in civic life to do so? Will the act do these things in the future? Does it effectively rectify failures of the past, especially failures to include the marginalized? All of these illustrate the criteria for whether, on balance, an action has increased or will increase the power, mutual self-determination, and well-being of those affected by government. The answers to these questions provide the means for people of faith and others to join important civic conversations about what is taking place in U.S. civic and political life.
Article 27. The 1788 Constitution made a firm decision for religious neutrality, thus allowing each person and group to practice the religion of their choice or none. Article 6 reads, quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," close quote. That was a radical choice because 11 of the 13 states at that time had religious qualifications for public officials. The same neutrality regarding religion was expressed in the very first words of the First Amendment to the Constitution, Section 4, ratified as part of the Bill of Rights in 1791. The Constitution's choice to forbid religious tests was historically novel and has had momentous consequences. For example, neither Thomas Jefferson nor Abraham Lincoln had any institutional religious affiliation. A religious test would have left the country without their service and that of others from non-Christian faith traditions or no faith tradition. The United States opened public offices to people of all religions, as well as to the non-religious, and limited the ability of government to interfere with self-determined religious choice.
Article 28. The religious diversity and neutrality of both the original Constitution and its First Amendment, parentheses, see Section 4, close parentheses, contradict past or present claims that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. In 1796, George Washington's administration made an official statement on the subject as part of an international treaty. Quote, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion," close quote. Note, Article 11 of the Barbary Treaties signed at Tripoli on November 4, 1796. Treaties are binding acts of state and help articulate a country's self-understanding on the international stage. Text access September 1st, 2023. End note. Many people involved in the movement for U.S. independence and the ratification of the Constitution had devout Christian faith, though others did not. The dominant religious practice of the times was certainly Protestant, as evidenced by the Christian ethos still present in our social fabric. However, it must be recognized that many who lived in and contributed to the establishment of the United States were not Christian and were instead people of various religions and worldviews. The ELCA gives thanks for many of the ways in which God worked through Christian individuals and in that ethos. In this sense, it is possible to speak of Christianity as contributing to the founding of this country and to claim that the original U.S. ethos was influenced by Christianity. However, this church rejects the baseless claims that the U.S. was founded on specifically Christian beliefs or that the U.S. Constitution is a result of special revelation, thus establishing a Christian nation. The Constitution established that the nation's sovereign is, quote, "we the people," close quote, not, quote, "we the faithful," close quote, or, quote, "we the Christians," close quote.
This concludes the reading of Section 3, Assessing the U.S. Constitutional Form of Government. Audio presentations of all 6 sections of the ELCA Social Statement, Faith and Civic Life, Seeking the Well-Being of All, are available from HereIPod from ELCA Advocacy. Find a link to the final, fully annotated version of the social statement in our show notes and from elca.org. Thank you for listening.